welcome everybody. We are going to be talking about the insect apocalypse. So hopefully you're in the right place. Run off to another one if you're not. I don't remember the title of our talk. Yeah. So, thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so many people interested in the smaller creatures on the planet. My name is Vicki Hird. I'm head of farming and supply chains at Sustain, which is the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. I hope you can hear all right over the hubbub at the back. And I'm also the author of a new book, Rebugging the Planet, which is available downstairs. Because I've been interested in invertebrates for all my life, but I haven't been working on invertebrates. I think they're at the heart of what we do. They're at the heart of the food system, invertebrates, not just insects. But they're often hidden to us. A lot of people don't realize their importance. A lot of people don't like them. They're led not to like them. And I'll talk about Dave in a minute, we both talk about why you need to be ambassadors to get more people to recognize the importance and the beauty of the invertebrate world. But they're never unimportant. They might be hidden, but they're never unimportant. But for too long, their importance, I think, has been judged in terms of how much damage they do, how much disease they could spread, how much crops they damage. And really, that's a very small amount of bugs that do damage or can hurt us. And the direction that that has led our research over the last few centuries has meant that a huge amount of research is on how bad they are and how can we exterminate them, how can we get rid of them, how can we eliminate them from our lives. So we have now got a situation where we're beginning to see, through long-term longitudinal studies, a really big problem in the invertebrates, from worms to flying insects to pollinators to the mayflies in the water system. There's really big problems of decline, so that's what we're going to be talking about. But the important thing is we've got scientists who are doing a lot of great work assessing this situation and looking at solutions. And Professor Dave Goulson is one of the best. I'm sure you're all aware of his work. As a scientist, he's got, I think, was it 500 papers to your name, looking at... Exaggerating. Oh, right. Many papers looking at bumblebees, but many other invertebrates, in terms of what's harming them, where they are, how they're living, and what we need to do. And I think Dave is a fantastic example of I'm saying an activist scientist, and we can talk about what that means. But a scientist who's prepared to speak out when things are going in the wrong direction and apply their evidence base to policy, which is so critical. Because I'm a campaigner. I've been 30 years as a campaigner. I was doing entomology work, pest control work 30 years ago, but I'm a campaigner, so I can't do the really detailed studies. So bridging that gap between those doing the research and the campaigners trying to change policy, and obviously the policymakers and government, absolutely critical. You know, we've got the citizens for the emergency. That's really important role to have. So David embodies that, to my mind, brilliantly. And you can see he's a professor of biology at Sussex University, and I'll let him explain to you why he's been working on bugs all these years. If I could ask you, why bumblebees? Why bugs?
Okay, yeah. I've been interested in bugs since I was 5 or 6 years old, and I don't really know why. I think actually lots of kids are fascinated by creepy crawlies if they get the chance to hold them. And when I was at primary school, I used to collect caterpillars from the hedge, and grasshoppers and anything else I could catch, and take them home in my lunchbox and keep them in jam jars and so on. Probably quite a strange, obsessive child, I guess. But I've been really lucky that I managed to make a career out of that childhood hobby. I never kind of grew out of it. Butterflies actually were my first.
Oh, right.
Right through to, I did a PhD on butterflies, and I eventually got a lectureship at Southampton University and was trying to build up a research group. I could not get any funding to work on butterflies. I had this slight feeling there was a kind of mafia of existing butterfly experts who didn't want anyone else moving in on their territory. And one day I was sitting in, there's a place called the Itchen Valley Country Park, which is, it's a nature reserve on the northern edge of Southampton. And I was just, I can't really remember why, but I was idly watching some bumblebees. There was a load of comfrey growing on a bank. And I noticed something odd, which was that the bees, they would fly around from flower to flower, but they would often fly up to a flower, and at the last second they'd veer away as if there was something wrong with it, without touching it, without landing. And I thought, that's a bit odd, you know, what do they do? So I went and did some reading, and I couldn't find an explanation in the books as to what was going on. So I set about trying to explain what their behaviour was all about. Sorry, this is a bit of a long anecdote, but it took 5 years to work out what was going on. But what they're doing is, bees, as they approach a flower, they have their antennae out, and they sniff it. And what they're smelling for is the smelly footprint left behind by a recent visitor. And if they can detect that another bee has recently landed on that flower, they know it's going to be empty, so there's no point in landing. They're really smart. And when I realized that, I kind of became hooked. You know, butterflies are all very well, they're beautiful, but actually they're quite stupid, kind of airheaded creatures in comparison. Bees are like the intellectual giants of the insect world, and they can learn, they can navigate, they're really kind of cool creatures with complicated social lives. So that's how I ended up studying bumblebees for the last 20, 30 years.
That's fascinating. I have similar many stories about why I ended up so fascinated by invertebrates. It's often their communication that is so incredible, particularly the social species. Absolutely, their vibration, chemicals, visual, so many ways that they communicate and learn how their role is within the social unit of a hive or a nest. Absolutely incredible. I think that's. But you've said something quite controversial about butterflies. We'll probably get some annoyed people. But I think that we should get to the core of the subject, because we haven't got that long. Because the title of this talk is "There an Insect Apocalypse?" And I would say invertebrate apocalypse as well. Particularly, there's new research about worms being particularly a threat from climate change. But is there an insect apocalypse? There's a lot of studies, there's a lot of controversy about some of those studies. Could you explore that a bit for us and tell us what you think is happening?
Yeah, it's complicated, sure, but the short answer is yes, or at the very least, insects mostly are declining so far as we know. There are huge knowledge gaps. So actually, I should have said this first. The honest truth is, nobody is counting most insects. You know, there are about 1.1 million known species of insect, and estimated to be maybe 3-4 million that we haven't yet named, which is amazing when you stop to think about it. There's extraordinary diversity of life on our planet that we haven't discovered yet. But obviously, if we haven't named them, we can't know how they're doing.
Yeah.
So only a few insects are being regularly counted, monitored, studied, but they overwhelmingly seem to be declining, with some exceptions. So, for example, in the UK, we have a really good long-running butterfly monitoring scheme, which has run since 1976, and that shows that roughly butterflies have declined in abundance by about 50%. Since, you know, I was 11 years old in 1976, so when I was a kid running around with a butterfly net, there were twice as many butterflies in the world. In Britain, I should say, sorry. Most insects are not the subject of a long-running recording scheme like that, but we do have maps which show big range contractions. So again, in the UK, there was a recent study showed that hoverflies and wild bee species in the UK have, on average, their ranges have declined by about 30% since 1990, which, you know, and that's across about 500 species. one of the most dramatic bits of evidence was from Germany, where the Krefeld study, as it's known, was published in 2017, where they found that a 76% decline in the biomass of flying insects on German nature reserves in a 27-year period. So seemingly 3/4 of the insects had disappeared in just over a quarter of a century, which is pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
Couple more, sorry, this is...
No, it's fine. I think we need to know.
Well, so there was a recent kind of meta-analysis published of global data that we have, and it estimated that the declines may not be that dramatic overall, maybe an average of between 1% and 2% a year, which doesn't sound like very much, but insects have probably been declining for 80 years. In my lifetime, if that figure is correct, then most of them have gone. And the odd thing is that most people have not noticed any of this. And there's only one thing, one aspect which the public have broadly noticed, which is this car windscreen thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which I don't know how many people here can remember a time when if you drove a long way in the summer, someone put their hand up. Yeah. If you went for a long drive in a nice day in the summer, you literally, after a few hours, couldn't see where you were going.
Had to wipe it.
And you can drive for hours these days. And it's not because modern cars are more streamlined. Kent Wildlife Trust did a study where they recruited vintage car owners to take part, and it didn't make any difference. Sadly, insects are declining.
Yeah, that was going to be the subheading of my book, or why we're not seeing insects, or getting insects back on our windscreen, but it was deemed a bit too negative. Also, it was seen as a lot of people, younger generation, wouldn't understand it because they've not seen that. Most people, 30 or under probably haven't seen that large number of insects on the windscreen. So we've got a real problem, and I think, I'm sure you're all aware, if you're losing that many flying insects, that means you're having a knock-on effect on all those bats and birds and everything that eats those insects, and on the crops and the nature that relies on those insects doing what they do so well. And I think, I'm sure everybody in this room is very aware of the role of the invertebrate world in providing our food, with the pollination, soil aeration, moving things around in the soil so it becomes inoculated with the right kind of fungi and spores, and then above ground the pollination, seed dispersal. You name it, invertebrates are either it or one part of the chain, aren't they? So if you read any of Dave's books, you'll see how rich and incredibly complex the world of the invertebrate is, and it's really worth having a look at those. Your latest book, which actually we haven't got on the table here, which is Silent Summer.
Silent Earth.
Silent Earth, sorry. He's getting that wrong. Silent Earth.
Borrowed from Silent Spring.
Spring, yes, that's the thing. Maybe that's what I've done. We're in this summer, getting to the winter. We need to stop us getting that far, but we need to stop the Silent Earth happening. What would your main message to this group audience who will be farmers and growers, campaigners, activists? What would your main messages from that book be?
Before I do, shall we just...
Oh, yes, we just have some pictures. Yeah.
So this is just... I had a PowerPoint presentation. I just thought I'm not going to go through it, most of it, but I've just got some nice pictures of insects, and I thought it would be fun to just celebrate their diversity. But before we do that, I put this slide up, I stole this off Twitter this summer. I just thought it epitomised the rather sad attitude of many people to insects. People don't like them, they're frightened of them, and anyone seeing this sign will think, oh my God, flying insects, I must run away,
Yeah, it's the wrong message.
All it was some flying ants, but someone thought it necessary to put that... Anyway, insects are cool, and we need to get that across to people. Incredibly diverse and variable. Let me show you just some of my favourite insects. This is the oak weevil, quite a common British species. There are 90,000 species of weevil in the world, and that's just one family of beetle.
Beautiful.
Amazing.
Absolutely beautiful.
And they all have these funny down-curved snouts, rather endearing. There are amazingly camouflaged insects like this bush cricket. Beautiful insects. This one's a mantis that mimics flowers to attract pollinators to their doom. There are insects that pretend to be other insects. This looks like a bumblebee, but it's actually a fly pretending to be a bee so it doesn't get eaten by a bird. There are beautiful, brightly coloured insects full of poisons they've sequestered from the plants they eat, again, to avoid being eaten. There are just crazy insects that we don't know any idea why that... This is a type of frog hopper that exudes little strands of wax from its bottom and makes this amazing kind of fluffy array. We have no idea what it's doing. And there's even a bug that looks like Elvis. Who'd have thought it? Anyway, that's...
Is it called the Elvis bug? Is it the Elvis bug?
I think it is. It has a long Latin name, but it comes from Thailand.
Yeah, that diversity is extraordinary. I mean, it's amazing to write books about invertebrates and insects because it's very difficult to know where to stop, isn't it? The complexity and the variety, the palette is so enormous that it's quite hard to narrow it down.
I realised, sorry, I didn't actually answer your question, did I?
Well, it was, yeah, what was your book's message for everybody?
The book's message is basically, it's pretty simple. We're losing our insects and we need them. You already touched on the consequences of, insects they make up about 70% of all known species on our planet. They are a big chunk of our biodiversity. They're food, as you mentioned, for umpteen birds, bats, lizards, frogs, fish, and so on. They pollinate most of our crops. They are really vitally important biocontrol agents, and a whole bunch of other things like recycling dead bodies and cowpats, dung beetles, and so on and so on. Basically, they're kind of the glue that holds ecosystems together, if you like. So our fate is inextricably intertwined with that of the insects, whether we like them or not. And so we need to change direction, I think. The way... We kind of know why insects are disappearing. I mean, I don't think we want to go into all the many drivers of it today.
Well, we could touch on them, actually, just quickly now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination, like a perfect storm of man-made factors. It's all down to us. Insects have been around for about 480 million years. They're one of the oldest creatures on land. And they've survived 5 mass extinction events, but we're now in the 6th mass extinction event. And now they're in trouble, and it's entirely due to us. Intensification of farming, we've developed a farming system around the world which is basically hostile to pretty much all forms of life, particularly the insects. The associated pesticide use is a big driver of insect declines. But then there are obviously habitat loss more broadly is a big factor. Climate change is starting to kick in. Fertilizers are having a big impact. Light pollution is affecting moths. There's others too, non-native species, diseases. But, and they could probably cope with a few things, but if you throw all of these different factors at them at once, it's hardly surprising that even the insects, the oldest creatures on the planet, are struggling.
And very adaptable creatures, even they can't adapt to them. Yeah. There's that study showing that the insects, at Rothamsted in Huntingdon, they're showing the flying insects are flying later because of climate change, and all that will have a knock-on effect as well, So climate change is a big one because they're such small animals, large surface area to volume ratio. Any change in temperature and change in water, drought or flooding has such a big impact on them. And if they can't move quickly away, it's very difficult for them. And the fragmentation of their habitats, which we found through the intensification of farming, it's really big factor. They can't move to a new place.
That's exactly it. That climates have changed in the past, and insects have coped with huge changes in the climate. But there were 2 real differences. One is that most of the previous changes were relatively slow, but also there were vast areas of habitat for them so that they could move gently northwards as it got warmer, whereas now they're living in little islands of habitat surrounded by a sea of inhospitable land, cities, roads, factories, farmland, and so on. So they've got to kind of hop potentially hundreds of miles to the next bit of habitat, and many of them just can't do that, sadly.
Yeah. So in terms of the positive message from your book, what can we do? As I said, we've got a mixed audience of fantastic people who are here because they really believe in agroecological food and farming. What would you say that one of the top things they could do once they leave here, for instance?
It's hard to know where to start because, so the final quarter of my new book, sorry to keep plugging, Silent Earth, is basically a list of things that we can do broken down into for different groups of people, one of which is farmers, one of which is politicians, one is gardeners. There's something that, I guess the good news is that we can all get involved, no matter who you are and what you do, because insects live all around us. They're in parks, they're in thousands of them in our garden. I mean, literally thousands of species can live in an urban garden. So even if you're not a farmer, you can do something to help, and they will recover really quickly, you know. So unlike pandas or rhinos or whatever, the insects could come back really fast if we provide them with somewhere to live, some food, stop poisoning them, and so on. So I've written in the past lots about gardening for insects, and if you've got a garden, there's even a small one, you can do a lot of different things. And I won't try and cover all those now. In terms of farming, and I guess the whole ethos of this conference is about moving towards more sustainable farming, and you've probably all got your own ideas about exactly how we should evolve the farming system to make it more sustainable. But from an insect's perspective, we need to reduce their exposure to pesticides. And it rather worries me that Europe has a clear strategy, this farm-to-fork strategy, which aims to halve pesticide use in the near future, whereas the UK doesn't seem to really have a plan to reduce pesticide use, so far as I can discern at present. But if we don't, I mean, actually pesticide use up till the present has continued to increase in terms of number of sprays applied per field. The number of sprays in the UK has increased 70% since 1990. For oilseed rape, it's increased threefold since 1988. So we're applying more and more, and somehow we need to rein this in, which could be via more organic farming, more biodynamic farming, or conventional farmers being persuaded and supported in using fewer pesticides. But integrated pest management would seem the obvious thing to mention at this point, but how exactly you implement that and enforce it is complicated.
Who defines what integrated pest management
is?
Yeah.
We also need, I did mention fertilizers earlier, but they often get forgotten in this story. People tend to focus on the obvious culprit of pesticides, but actually fertilizers are having really profound negative effects on insects and on the environment more generally. This eutrophication of soils and rivers and lakes and so on has massive impacts on biodiversity. We end up with hedgerow plant communities that are really simplified and that consist only of a handful of plants that thrive in really high nitrogen soils. And there's some really interesting recent evidence that plants grown in highly fertilized soils are less palatable to insect herbivores. So you end up with things like butterfly caterpillars do much less well in hedgerow plants that are grown in high fertility soils. So there are some surprising kind of effects that most people are unaware of. I think we also somehow need to set aside more land for insects and for nature more generally. Whether that be small patches of land within farms, setting aside the least productive bits of land, and there are lots of ways of doing that. There's a really interesting study from, it's 8 years old now, it's work done by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and they did a big farm study in Buckinghamshire where they persuaded farmers to take 8% of their arable fields out of cultivation and put it into wildlife habitats, and they had control fields where they carried on business as usual. And the interesting thing was, although initially there was a slight reduction in yield from taking 8% of the cropped area away, actually after 3 years the yield had risen back up again because they were getting a higher yield per area as a benefit from
having the invertebrates around.
Yeah. So you know, if we could get that message out there that actually we don't have to farm every square inch of the land. I also would, personally, I'm a fan of rewilding, which I know is a bit of a Marmite subject. Not everyone likes it. We obviously need to grow food. We can't rewild everywhere. That would be bonkers. But the least productive land, I think we should at least consider giving farmers the option of turning it, instead of trying to grow food in areas which aren't really suited to producing much food, maybe an alternative is capturing carbon, supporting biodiversity and providing recreation and tourism instead. And if you get the chance to go to somewhere like the Knepp estate in the spring, it's amazing how rich in wildlife it is and how inspiring it is. And I would be very happy to see a few more Knepps. That would help, I think. And so on and so on. I'm sure you've got your own ideas.
Yeah, I mean, in my book, I've got lots of tips throughout in terms of what you can do. And I think the key thing we'd both say is we need to be acting as citizens as well as what we can do in our gardens or our farms. We need to be bugging our politicians and our local authorities and our government to do things differently and to implement things which really support farmers and growers to do things differently, and actually gardeners to do things differently. Sort of, you know, the kind of policies which will really generate a change in every inch of land. So you've got those habitats, as you say, you know, which are really for nature, and yet the rest of the farm can be for nature as well, can be working with nature. So it's not seen as either or. You've got nature here and farming there. It's a continuum. And everybody here is very supportive of that, I think. But yeah, there's many things you could do, but I would say one of the biggest things, as well as acting as farmers in a way which supports the invertebrates, and there are many ways you can do that, but also bugging your MP and your local authority, and getting your local authority to stop spraying hedgerows and cutting grass, you know, doing the right kind of thing. Happily, the highways agency are not fertilising their hedges, their verges now. For the reason that they can see, it costs them, but it allows just grasses to grow when they could be having wildflowers, and they're supporting the pollinators. So that's a really good policy development from a government body, you know, effectively a government-funded body. It's brilliant. I think that's a really good initiative. So there's lots of things people can do. One of the things I know that's been really successful, and it's a particular strength of the UK over probably 200 years, is kind of citizen science, but it's really come into its own in the last few years. Do you think it's really working, and what can we do differently with citizen science that could really drive change?
There are so many different types of citizen science, it's hard to give a single answer. Some citizen science, things like the big butterfly count, I think are more about public engagement than actually providing much in the way of, you know, counting butterflies for one day a year doesn't give you terribly robust, useful scientific data.
It's not being...
Not really, no. But on the other hand, if it gets people looking at butterflies in their garden, then that's great. So many citizen science programs are probably more about educating people and engaging with people than about the science. But some are really good for the science as well. I mean, the butterfly data I mentioned from the UK, that's probably the longest running and most detailed population data set for any insect in the world, and it's all done on volunteers. It's citizen science. You know, there are literally thousands of people who walk a transect, the same one every fortnight through the spring and summer, counting and identifying all the butterflies they can see, and it provides really powerful data, shows which species are declining, where they're declining, and so on. It's such a shame that it's hard to do that for most insects because they're nowhere near as easy to identify. There is now, I started a bee walk scheme to count bumblebees, which is much smaller than the butterfly one and has only been running for 13 years, I think.
Is that across the country?
It's nationwide. If anyone can identify bumblebees and wants to take part, then please start a transect in your local area.
How can people get hold of these?
The website of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, should you be interested. So there are some citizen science projects that are really good. And also, I mean, I'm involved in there's a little organisation called the Buzz Club, which is a slightly incompetent, very tiny organisation, which is trying to engage with gardeners in testing different interventions, different things they can do to support bugs in their gardens. Things like which type of bee hotels work best. We've recently been experimenting with earwig hotels, which are slightly less familiar bug houses, and getting normal citizens with a garden to do a mini experiment, and then if we get hundreds of people to do those experiments, actually you can get useful data as long as it's a relatively straightforward, sort of foolproof project. So they can be really powerful, but they need careful thought, because you can just generate a bunch of junk.
There was a bug splatter test thing that Bug Life did. You could download, I think, a thing that you put on your car for a day or something, or for a while, and then send it on, and they'll find out, and they've got some results from that over time, because it's been done for a while, haven't they? So I think that is a good way of engaging people and getting people interested, as well as possibly giving some results. Do compile any questions you've got to Dave, and online, please. I should have welcomed all the online viewers. Do think some questions. Hopefully I'll get hold of them. I can't actually get them on the phone that I thought I could, so if somebody can help me with that, it'd be good. But think of your questions. I did want to ask Dave just a final question about being an activist scientist. And I know a lot of activist scientists are out there, but are you getting attacked? Do you feel you need support from this kind of community? How do you feel about being a scientist who's prepared to speak out?
It's an odd area, actually. I mean, some people use the word activist as an insult, so I don't know quite how to take it. But for most of my career, the work I did was really uncontroversial. So I started studying bumblebees and their foraging behaviour, and eventually I moved into trying to understand why they were declining. Yeah. And we did a lot of work on how we could get more flowers into the landscape to provide them with more food, so doing research on which garden plants were most valuable and which seed mixes worked best in arable farming for bumblebees and so on. And none of that was at all controversial. You know, if you say we need more flowers, nobody gets upset. Everyone agrees with you. But then in about 2010, at a time when the Bumblebee Conservation Trust was in its early days, and I was involved with that, this story about neonicotinoid insecticides started to blow up. French beekeepers were saying that these new insecticides were killing their bees, and there was a lot of attention focused on honeybees, but some of the members of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust started asking us whether they were impacting on bumblebees. And nobody had done any research on bumblebees at the time, so we thought, well, let's
Nobody had assessed their impact on bumblebees.
It all really started with very much focused on honeybees, which often hog the limelight of the insect world, sadly.
Big economic value that they have. Yeah.
Anyway, so we designed an experiment, and we did a study on their impact to see whether they did have an impact on bumblebee nests, and we found that the nests grew much more slowly and produced way fewer queen bees at the end of the season if they were exposed to even tiny traces of these insecticides. They're neurotoxins. They're designed to kill insects. So it wasn't stunningly surprising. Yes. Anyway, the study was published in Science, which is a high-profile journal. And I must admit, I was completely naive. I had not anticipated the backlash of abuse that we would get. And quickly there were articles appearing online claiming that I was a scientist for hire, that I made the data up. It was really nasty. I mean, at its worst, there was a photograph of me grabbed off the internet, posted on Twitter with the letters C-U-N-T pasted across the middle of it.
Oh my goodness!
You've got to be quite thick-skinned not to get upset. So there is this really nasty aspect to if you get involved in research that impacts on big business. Yeah. Then there's a backlash, and it's not pretty, I'm afraid.
No. Well, I'm really admiring of you doing that, and very grateful. So hope you know that. I'm sure everybody here is as well. Can we go to questions now? Yeah, absolutely. So important. If you think neonics have been around for a long time, and nobody had looked at what they were doing on the bumblebees, or in fact the wild bees either, were they? Yeah.
No.
Questions? Got a question down there. If you could take the mic.
Hi Vicki, hi David. David Gardner. A couple of things I'd like you to comment on really, David. The first one is, I've been around a little bit longer than you.
A bit closer.
I've been around a little bit longer than you, and I feel one of the things that's led to the decline of insects is we live in a much, much cleaner world today. Cleaner. So we're much better at handling rubbish. And there are far fewer livestock farms kicking around, a lot fewer livestock farms kicking around from when I was a kid. All of those were breeding areas, feeding places for flies and insects.
Yeah.
And they've gone, and if you look at what's happening with rubbish right now, it's now all going to incinerators, so we've not even got tips that insects can potentially breed on. And I feel that's been a really big factor in the loss of insects. Dead carcasses, that sort of thing.
So specialisation in farming, massive problem.
Well, certainly on the livestock side. And of course, a lot of livestock now is indoors.
Yeah.
So that's been one factor. The other factor I would like to raise as a potential opportunity is I spend quite a lot of time looking at where tomorrow's energy is going to come from. And I think it's a much bigger problem than most people appreciate. And I think photovoltaics have a huge role to play. Whether we like it or not, we are going to have to cover quite a big area of the land with photovoltaics, if not in this country, in other countries. And it strikes me there's a real opportunity to mix photovoltaics with biodiversity. And for two reasons, really. One is you're not cultivating it every year and harvesting it every year, so it's left undisturbed, and potentially you keep the public out of it. And so really I'd like to comment on those 2 points.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. Two things. Sort of relating to your first point about rubbish, I mean, being overly tidy is definitely harmful to biodiversity. Leaving odd corners for weeds to grow or whatever really helps. And that applies obviously to farms, but also to gardening to some extent. But the opportunity of solar panels is really interesting, and it has been recognised. So there are trials underway sowing seed mixes underneath the panels, because there's a lot of land in the rows between the panels, and it's not going to be ploughed, it's not going to be sprayed with insecticides. It's going to be there for at least 30 years. And if we could get the seed mixes right, find perhaps woodland edge plants that don't mind the little bit of the shade that the panels provide, then there's huge potential for big areas of land to be really quite rich in biodiversity. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out, but I 100% agree with you.
Yeah, there's real potential there, and you can even have livestock on those systems as well. A bit of livestock, so a bit of income from livestock. There's also whenever I do a talk to people about rebugging, I say leave your garden to be a bit messy, and that goes for a garden and a farm. Leave the messy bits. But the homogenisation and specialisation of farming is probably one of the biggest factors. It's huge fields with one single crop. Anyway, yes. Another question from a lady. There you go. Thanks. I'll go man, woman, if I can.
Very good practice.
Yeah.
Yes, so I only want to add that I am chair of South Hill Community Energy, which is a 4.5 megawatt solar farm about 17 miles from here, and over half of the land we have leased has been given over to improving biodiversity. We've been doing bird surveys, insect surveys. I have 100 jars of honey waiting to be sold. It really is a massive opportunity, and we'll have sheep on there next summer. And I know we are not alone, so that's what community and other solar farms could be doing.
Yeah. Good if it's community-based as well. That's a really great thing. Are there any questions? Can anybody tell me if there are questions online? Anybody from organising things? Because I can't find it.
How can we stop people using household insecticides against wasps and flies? That's the top voted question out of about 20.
Thank you so much. How can we stop people using insecticides at home?
I guess there's two ways. One is educating people that they're unnecessary and that they're probably toxic to your pets, to the fish in your pond, probably to you too. It's just bonkers that we sell poisons in garden centres for people to people with no training at all. You can go into your local, even supermarkets sell them, and buy a whole array of toxins to spray willy-nilly. I'm sure people often don't bother to wear gloves, don't bother to read the back of the label properly. I personally would ban pesticide use for urban areas. And
hasn't France done that?
Yeah.
France has actually banned a lot of chemicals.
Yeah, back in 2018. So not just domestic use, but the local council can't use things like glyphosate in street management and so on. And Paris is still standing, so if Paris can be pesticide-free, why can't Oxford, why can't London, it seems to me.
And the other, I was going to say, sorry.
Sorry, no, so one thing is persuading people not to use them, the other would be legislation, and, the ultimate answer would be to ban the stuff.
To ban the stuff. I mean, you as ambassadors can show people why these insects are good. Like a wasp nest can be incredibly brilliant for pest control in your garden. A kilogram of flies a year for a small wasp nest. What's not to like, And people obviously have the big fear factor, but if you can educate them, you will be ambassadors, talk to people, show them the photographs about how beautiful the spiders and wasps and other bugs are. That will go some way, because the best people that people believe are their friends and their tribe and their community. Me telling people isn't, you telling people you know is much more powerful. So be the ambassadors for the bugs. Are there any other questions online? Oh, sorry, lady here.
Hi both. Thank you for all your work that you do. Dave, I just wondered if you'd heard about the new assist trial that CEH have been involved with, which I'm very excited about because it takes wildflowers through the middle of fields and is already, I think the paper's about to come out, but already showing huge increases in cereal production with not just strips along the edges, but wildflower strips through the middle. And I think that's something a lot of farmers, will want to try.
That sounds, I haven't seen the study yet. I look forward to it coming out, but it sounds brilliant. I mean, if we can show that we can, still produce lots of food while looking after nature better, then everybody wins. So, yeah, fantastic.
Is there another question online?
Is there a danger of some insect populations becoming overabundant, i.e. plagues of locusts?
Insects becoming overabundant question.
Well, so there are some insects which are problematic, and there are some insects that are thriving despite all the problems with the world, particularly ones associated with anthropogenic habitats, things like the housefly, which thrives in all the organic waste we produce, and is now resistant to every known pesticide and spreads disease and so on and so on. So climate change is benefiting some of these species. There's concern that malaria will move back into much of Europe in the coming decades as the mosquitoes that spread it benefit from climate change. So there are some insects that are thriving and are a cause for concern, certainly. Sadly, the irony is that the insects we would want to be thriving tend to be declining, and the ones that we'd perhaps rather not be doing so well, the ones that spread disease and so on, are the very ones that are doing well.
And some of the key to it is diversity, isn't it? We've created environments which are single species of cattle, or single, human species in vast quantities, which allow one species to, bug to thrive, which if we had more diversity in how we have animals, how we have crops, how we live our lives, more bugs could survive.
One of the problems with industrialised farming is with big monocultures, you tend to get an explosion of whatever insect eats the crop you're growing, because it's such a simplified system. There aren't many enemies and so on, which is obviously a powerful argument for dividing your fields up.
Absolutely, and field edges, the loss of field edges is one of the biggest factors in loss of invertebrates on farm. So any other questions over this side? Should go to a man now, because I've done all 2 women. Sorry, the person there, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very keen on peat restoration and the role of peat, in terms of carbon capture, rather than trees. But I'm not really giving any thought to insects and their role or their existence on peat. And I wondered if you could, on peat. So I wondered if you could just enlighten me.
Sorry,
peatland restoration. What's the role of invertebrates in peatland restoration, and how they can?
That's a good question. Pass. I mean, it's completely mad that we damage peat bogs to extract peat for garden use and the like. I believe domestic use is being banned. Is it already banned, or is it?
No, it's not yet.
It's the end of this year, I think. But horticultural use will continue. Peat bogs are fantastic habitat for insects, but I'm not sure how vital insects are to the restoration of peat bogs. I think it's more about getting the hydrology right and stop digging the stuff up, but I'm not an expert. Sorry, without the microphone, I can't hear.
Sorry. I think they're going to be an integral part of the system, aren't they?
Yes. There's some really amazing rare insects that thrive in peat bogs that have obviously suffered from the loss of those bogs.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't get whatever it was you said.
We've got time for one more question. One from online, yes.
Yeah, is there a problem for insects with light pollution?
Light pollution, absolutely.
Yeah, so there's not many studies on this, but it's clear evidence that nocturnal flying insects. Obviously, many of them are attracted to lights, things like moths, and they expend a lot of energy flying round and round in circles, bashing themselves to death, become easy prey to spiders and bats and so on by doing that. So there's a kind of fairly obvious direct impact of light pollution, but there are more subtle impacts too. Things like glowworms being unable to find their mate because they can't see the light of the female because it's not bright enough to compete with the artificial lights. And there was a really interesting but slightly sad study. There are a species of African dung beetle, the ones that roll balls of dung at night, and they use the line of the Milky Way as their compass so that they can roll their dung ball in a straight line to the hole they've dug. But with light pollution, they can't detect the Milky Way, so they go all over the place and get lost, which is rather sad, really. So yeah, basically, yet another problem.
And there are solutions. Yeah, having downward-facing lights. If you've got to have lights, there's lots of solutions.
Yeah, shielding them, turning them off.
Yeah.
You know, why we have so many lights on in the middle of the night, I don't know.
Absolutely, yeah. Turning them off, having them sensitive to movement.
Yes.
One more question, quick one.
Thank you. I was just going to add to the lighting problem. You could perhaps tone down the frequencies because the blue light, the recent circadian research says blue light is telling life that it's constantly summertime, and that and a lot of natural health practitioners actually use some red light for health reasons.
So changing
the frequencies could.
Yeah. So changing the light frequencies, absolutely. There are if you look online, there are quite a lot of organisations that give advice on this now. I looked the other day, so that's quite helpful. I'm afraid, 45 minutes is not long enough to cover the insect apocalypse, but there's so many things you can do. Please read the books. Dave's books are absolutely wonderful. I've got loads of tips in my book. And Dave will sign books if people want to buy one downstairs. He will be able to sign them from now on. I've got to rush off to something else.
Yeah, Vicki can't sign her books, but it's great and it's downstairs, so do buy it.
Yeah, I can sign it later. I'm here for the whole conference. But do be the ambassador for the bugs and get everybody rebugging if you can. Thank you, Alex. Can you give thanks to our professor?
And thank you, Vicki.